Before we begin, I would like to encourage everyone listening to the podcast to sign up for my upcoming workshop where we will learn how to improve our relationships with each other while focusing on the relationship with ourselves. The dowsing protocol is called the Twin Flame Within Restructuring, and the workshop will be held on Saturday, July 30th on Zoom. Registration for the class is only $80, which is a limited time offer for this date only, so if this is something that you want to add to your dowsing practice, please go to vitalbioenergetics.com and register today. And now for today's podcast. Welcome to High Vibes with your host, Bill G. At High Vibes, we're looking into what it means to be a fourth dimensional being in an ever-changing world. We hope that by listening to our podcast, you can feel a greater sense of peace and connection as we collectively raise our energetic vibration to the next level. And now for today's podcast. Hello and welcome to High Vibes. I'm your host, Bill G, and today's special guest is Dr. Daniel Atkins. Now, Dr. Daniel Atkins is a intuitive psychologist who has just launched his own podcast, which is called Be the Vessel. And we've agreed that we're going to do kind of a little exchange here. Well, he's going to be on our podcast talking about what he's doing. I'll be on his podcast talking about what I'm doing. So it's going to be a whole lot of fun. So Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here.
I think to get started, I think the best thing to do is to let's get to know you a little bit better. So before we go into your journey, let's just talk about what an intuitive psychologist does in order to help people to expand consciously, to release trauma, or to just do some healing work.
Sure. Well, the combination of words is intentional. The psychologist part comes from me having trained as a clinical psychologist and spending a good amount of time in that world and working with trauma from a Western clinical perspective, and really what I would call sort of the modern edges or the front lines of trauma research, which is integrative and utilizes the connection between mind and body and understands really the manifestations of trauma that are stored in the body. That really relates to my own personal journey because the reason I started to expand and move beyond the traditional forms of therapy and healing were because of my own sickness that 10 plus years of sickness that, and sort of when I say sickness, like debilitating widespread pain and fatigue. But I knew that there was there was no answers within the fields of traditional medicine and psychology, and I pursued them. So it led me to seek further. It pushed me really out of desperation to look for other answers. And when I was ready, sort of, I would speak to a sort of kind of spiritual readiness or on a soul level. When I was ready to call in those forms of healing, I started to be open to it. And, different sorts, I experienced different sorts of body-based modalities, but also a lot of intuitive healers, a lot of healers with what I would say other ways of knowing, alternative ways of knowing, of tuning into me, of working with energy medicine. And I could feel the energy of my emotions, and I could just feel the energy, you might refer to them as the energy of the chakras begin to open and move. And I could feel the nervous system, which mine was incredibly dysregulated. And that's really where there's a bridge, I think, between the Western world and more alternative modalities, is how the nervous system becomes trapped with these energetic blockages and creates tension and influences immune functioning and all that stuff. I could feel the release of these blockages. But really what that led to for me was the cultivation of my own intuition. I started to recognize my own intuitive capacities. I started at first really just checking in with myself, asking myself yes or no questions, and starting to hear answers, and then starting to see some visions in meditation, and ultimately the way it came through to me was starting to hear spirit guides. And I started playing with that in my clinical work. Now, I was at a point where it was clear I needed to leave the traditional path, and that wasn't really going to be widely accepted in the way that I had trained. And I actually just received a license too, and then was like, yeah, I think I have to pursue another path. So I started doing my own thing. I started writing a lot. I started a website. I registered an LLC, and I was working with a lot of people at the time with chronic pain because that was an interest of mine, and it continued to be. What I discovered was that, you know, most, if not all, chronic pain, and this is really well researched in the clinical world as well, is not structural and is often a manifestation of trauma. Though trauma is such a buzzy word now. It's so big that a lot of times I feel I can simplify it and redefine it in my own terms, because it tends to lose meaning when it's used so much. So I started working with debilitating chronic pain, but I would address it from this trauma-focused perspective. And I would start to share that, you know, the way I work with trauma is a little bit different. I'm guided by a different source. I'm guided by intuitive wisdom, and I still have my training. I still have that clinical knowledge, but I will tune in meditation. I will get messages. I will be guided about where to go. And what started to happen was I could identify the ancestral lineages of trauma, past life trauma would show up. So a more expansive world of trauma than just, let's say, early life experiences or acute conditions. And it's interesting how it developed, in the sense of it developed in a co-creative way, because I would begin to guide clients and they would become intuitive, actually.
Right.
Your podcast is called High Vibes. I would say that the vibration I started to live at actually served as sort of a beacon for those I work with to begin opening that space in themselves. So I use a lot of breath work and meditation. I guide people to tune into the heart space. And what would happen is, sometimes it would function like past life regression. Sometimes it would function like trauma that wasn't theirs. And so trauma of all forms began to emerge. And I started to see that that's really what I meant by intuitive psychologist. At first, I knew in some way, shape, or form, I was a bridge. I was a bridge between the training and the world I came from and where I was going. In some ways, my clients have guided me to see exactly what that is looking like as we set the intention to use intuitive wisdom and see what shows up. And a lot of times it is these forms of trauma that go beyond the current lifetime, though the truth is that it's always reenacted in the current lifetime. So it's always going to have some resonance and some current sort of prescience as to why it's showing up now. And then from there, I still do individual work, but really the path I see that is unfolding for me is workshop, where is group work. Mm-hmm. And so I lead groups and workshops, and a lot of those, you know, there is collective trauma healing and what I might refer to as shared lineages that emerge as we enter into a more collective intuitive space. But it's also functions around the meditations that I lead, which are energetically based. And I call in sort of what I might call light frequencies or light wisdom to really amplify the collective space. And from that, things happen. People wake up, people begin to tune into a frequency that they're not used to. And I would say that in that space, ultimately, we are creating the optimal environment for healing. We are entering into setting the sort of the fertile soil for what is meant to be released, and to walk toward the brave new vision for our lives.
Where are you currently working out of right now?
So part of my own journey was packing up everything I own in where I'd lived in Chicago for 10 plus years, and driving across the country to California, where I currently live in Santa Barbara, though I'm about to move to the LA area.
So when people are seeking you out, in if they want to seek your services, are you mostly just online?
I do work mostly virtually, yes.
Okay. Excellent. You've got a very interesting perspective and journey here. So most of us are defined by our trauma, unfortunately, but it is fortunate too, because Catalyst does lead us to greater things very often. And when you say that you grew out of necessity, I think everybody in this field can say that with absolute certainty. The person I was talking to for last week's show, Barbara Stone, her great awakening was while she was getting her psychology degree, was she had breast cancer. She was like 3 courses away from graduation, and she gets the terminal diagnosis of breast cancer, and so she just had to make a choice at that point. Is what going to define me, or is I'm going to do all this and then end it, or am I going to use this as an opportunity to grow and be better and to find a new way to bridge that Western Eastern mindset to create something new? And she's done a wonderful job at that. So if you get a chance to listen to that interview, that was especially a lot of fun. I'm interested to know if as much as you're willing to share here, is your journey here. When you say sickness, what do you mean precisely by that got you to that catalyst point, that breaking point? Western ain't doing it for me anymore. I need something more. I need to really tap into that inner voice and that inner healing ability.
Yeah, of course. And, it is a medicine. It is a gift. It is an invitation. It doesn't feel like that, though, as I've said or sort of written about, like, I would have preferred a nicely written letter, that it was time for me to expand. But I probably would have thrown that letter in the trash because I'm a stubborn person. I didn't want to, as most of us are really attached to the desires of the ego. And I wasn't ready to let that go. I was suffering. I was miserable, but I wasn't ready to let it go. So without the sickness, without the debilitating physical experience, I may not have been open or ready, at least for a long time. And so I can speak to that. So that happened around 2011, where I really felt ill, and and now I can use the reference. It kind of felt like COVID, like having COVID like every day for a while. Though, I think what most of us, as you said, most of us healers or most of us in life, when you experience sort of like a harrowing or a debilitating event, what you may find as you go toward the trauma and start to peel back layers is that it didn't come out of the blue. It was cultivated based on sort of the reenactments and the lessons you were meant to learn in this life. So we don't come in as blank slates. So I came in, I had a really dysregulated nervous system. And of course,
I'm sorry. What do you mean by a dysregulated nervous system? I've never heard of that before.
So what I mean by that, so in the clinical world, there's a lot of discussion of regulating the nervous system, and specifically being in a window of tolerance to comfortably experience, identify, and express your emotions, as well as deactivate what's called the stress response. Most people are familiar with being in fight or flight. Like if you see a tiger, the body responds to threat and gets you to run or to fight or to play dead. But the difficulty in modern life is that most things are not tigers. Most things are text messages or getting cut off in traffic or just being alive and experiencing emotions, that the brain has become wired and conditioned to scan for danger and threat. So most of us, and then we add substances into our lives. And so most of us are basically living in a chronic state of stress response. And that, all the research shows that this debilitates our immune system and manifests pain, chronic pain and disease and illness and all kinds of things. So when I say came into the world with a dysregulated nervous system, I mean that my brain was wired for hypervigilance and scanning for danger and threat that rarely felt safe. So it may manifest just as someone who considers himself to have a lot of anxiety, who always appears nervous, who rarely feels comfortable in their body. So that's really what I mean. So I came in with a lot of that already. I was very colicky. I was very tantrumy. I used to cut all the tags out of my shirts. I had, a lot of it overlaps with what we see in autism spectrum disorder, a lot of sensation difficulties, very hypersensitive. I received tons of diagnoses as a kid. I couldn't pay attention. I was, and later on, I suffered from bouts of depression and anxiety, and I just really wasn't a happy young person. The way that I would speak to it now is that not only did I come in carrying some of that on a physiological level, but, we're carrying ancestral trauma. Go back and look at the lineage of your parents. My mother had a particularly traumatic lineage and upbringing, and so there's a lot to be healed there. You go back 1, 2, 3, 10, 11, 12 generations. It didn't get better really for the human race. So we're carrying a lot of that, and then we can dip into the karmic lessons and past life lessons and things like that. But I like to be a bridge, and I do my best to stay in the bounds of what's accessible for people and to meet people where they're at. Ancestral lineage is fairly accessible. It makes sense in terms of what we know about epigenetics and what is carried forth. People can sort of wrap their heads around that, and I can integrate that with what I was just describing around nervous system language, and I can create that bridge. So anyway, that was a lot of my early life, and had really very poor capacity and tolerance for my emotions. They're very intense. And so at a certain point, I started using substances as one of the only ways I knew how to cope. And so all that was building. By the time I was, in my early 20s and was getting sick, it wasn't like I was this, super, I was high functioning in some ways, I was pretty intelligent through sheer force of will, because my mind was not a comfortable place to be. But my relationships were very poor. I was partying a lot. I had no vision of who I wanted to be or who I even really was. So when I got sick, it feels like, oh, I can't believe this came out of the blue. This was so unfortunate. But really, it was the thing that saved my life, honestly, because it started to pull me away from the really, with all forgiveness and grace for myself, the ways that I was attempting to cope with and protect myself against these deep-rooted vulnerabilities and emotions and aspects of myself that I didn't want to see or look at, which is really how trauma functions. Trauma isn't like the way that we talk about trauma. It's really a protection against the emotion states and the beliefs about ourselves that we don't want to feel. It's a lot of the symptoms and what you see in the DSM. A lot of that is protection against the sort of what is perceived to be dangerous. And what I would speak to of the source material is really that conditioned beliefs about ourselves, others in the world, and associated emotion states at the root. That's what I feel the source material is that we're coping with. And so that's what I was coping with. And, but I didn't, the sickness led me to, I got the diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, which is one of a category of diagnoses like fibromyalgia amidst a laundry list of widespread body pain and fatigue syndromes that have no biomedical etiology, but are heavily debated because people who suffer from them do not want to receive, they don't want to feel at fault naturally. And historically, it has been true that, medical doctors will say, well, we can't help you, so it's probably all in your head, or you need to go see. And that's not
chemical imbalance.
Right. And that's not received very well by the self. So what will happen is sufferers will become militant, particularly in this CFS community, which I wrote my dissertation on. The sufferers will become militant and demand, more research is done, and it must be linked to the monovirus, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not denying these, it's psychophysiological. There's a physiological component. I'm not denying these elements to it. I had mono, I have the Epstein-Barr virus, but that's not really what this is about. And not only is there a psychological and a mind-based source, but there's a spiritual source too. There's a reason that this is coming to you in your life at the time that I wasn't living the life that I was meant to live, and I'm not sure how else I would have gotten there.
And there's also a point where you're giving away your power. It's saying that I'm not. Oh, I now have a label. Now I can give my power to the label, to the diagnosis, and now it's somebody else's problem. It's not my problem anymore.
100%. And what that shows you is that you were always giving away your power, and that, that it just came in the representation of the sickness, but I was always giving away my power. I never learned how to own my power. It only came out as reactive anger and stress. And so I had to learn, a harder way, I would say, how to start what I would call regulating how to start learning about the nervous system, how to start learning about my stress, because a lot of, it's not random when these symptoms come on, learning about the stress reactivity and where the triggers were, because triggered, it's really our trauma, our conditioning being lit up. Someone says something, it triggers a belief about ourselves, it triggers an associated emotion, and that stuff may not be conscious. All we may know is suddenly my back hurts. But when you start to go toward the work, when you start to create safety,
Right.
really a lot of the foundations of the work are creating safety in the nervous system, in the mind, to allow that stuff to emerge. And that's not so different from, cultivating intuitive wisdom. It looks differently, and it may happen. One may come before the other. Typically the safety may come first. So that was really like a 10 plus year journey after getting sick. And the experience has served me in working with others, because I see the roller coaster of hope and disappointment and despair and hopelessness, particularly when it's so disabling and you really don't see a way out. You don't feel, you're not sure where to turn, which is why a lot of the people that get referred to me are those who have felt failed by the traditional medical systems, and because I have another way of being with it, because I've navigated it myself. That also lends conviction, and what you really want on this path, and what really heals is conviction, is the conviction in the mind that you can heal, the body, because there's a lot of mixed messages, and you don't know what to believe, and when you're suffering, you're not sure you can. But I was pretty, it was 10 plus years. So I went through all of my training. I was getting to the end of my doctorate program. I had come percentages incrementally better. I had focused on this. I had explored the world of what I might call mind body medicine, where there's a lot of psychologically minded doctors doing this kind of work. But the truth is, I was suffering a lot still. I was not nowhere near I wanted to be. I was lacking confidence in working with this population because I was still suffering so much.
Right.
And it was really at the tail end of my training, right when I had got my degree and started working as a postdoc, and then eventually becoming licensed, where it just became clear, where I had become open at that point to more intuitive healing. And the message I was getting was, you can stay at, a traditional sort of psychoanalytic attachment focused therapist. You can keep trying to do this work, staying at this clinic in Chicago and working, one-on-one and with kids, which I did like kids, but it was like, you'll just keep getting sick. You'll just keep getting sick. And not until you really break loose some of the boundaries of not just your circumstances, but your mind, of what you're capable of your power. My power was so locked away. I had so much to give, and I knew that. And I knew that there were books in me, and I knew that there was this curiosity, and that there was this unsatisfied part, that the theories I'd learned and the way I was living my life wasn't enough. I wasn't truly happy. I was still so attached to my thinking and trying to be smart enough and trying to be validated for these external things, that all the power was locked away. So as I started to take that leap, which was scary and not many people understood, but what the traumatic event becomes is a source of conviction, because as you can heal that, truly, if you can heal your body in that way, you believe you can do anything. You take that conviction with you, and that conviction led me to start doing my own thing, and that conviction led me to move, and that and it builds on itself till you have full conviction, clarity, and conviction in who you are, in your truth, and what you have to give to this world.
And the thing is, you got an interesting story. You got an interesting background on how you got to where you are. It's not by no means a unique story, but it is a story that really, I think, is going to really help connect you to people who are maybe listening to the show and like, yeah, that's my story too. And that's where we, as practitioners, we're always looking for that as well, because whenever I'm looking for we actually did a show on this with the other members of the co-op. What are we looking for in a therapist? And what we're looking for is empathy. We're looking for somebody who gets me. So if I'm somebody who is dealing with chronic pain due to trauma or due to emotional things, I'm going to be thinking, hey, Dan seems like somebody who understands me, to the point where I'm going to want to give him a call and find out what's going on. So let's talk about this podcast you're doing. So you just started up this podcast calling Be the Vessel. So let's just talk a little bit about what why you decided to do a podcast and what your goal is for this thing.
Well, a lot of the things that I decide to do now are messages from spirit. Basically, I at a certain point, I started to let go of the thinking mind. Now I still have plenty of thinking, but it stopped being the force that was guiding all my decisions. I could reflect back and see that none of them were really serving me. All of them were fear-based. And a lot of the fear conditioning and the wiring in the brain leads to this distorted or sort of sick thing. In some ways, the sickness is in the thinking. It's really, and it's just manifesting in the body. So I started listening to this intuitive wisdom, and it was a little bit, let's say, it brings up all the fears and doubts you have about, and the uncertainties and what am I really listening to? What am I being guided by? But I've surrendered to it in a lot of ways and learned along the way and some of the pitfalls. But it has started to become my sort of true north as to what I'm meant to call forth. And so a lot of that has been writing. A lot of that, of course, is still my healing service. But it came to a point where I knew very clearly that I was meant to use my voice, and that I knew that in all of what I sort of offer for people, that there is a frequency, something that comes through in my voice, whether it's the meditations or the information or whatever. And the podcast began to make sense, began to appear as a way to deliver the content, not just through writing, but through voice, and to expand from there. And it literally, I got the message from one of my guys that it was time to start. And I'd had played around with, I've made content online for a little while, just not really. And this is the game we slip into. And this is what we were speaking to earlier, not to get a bunch of followers, to become, some online influencer, really just to deliver the medicine that I feel is meant to come through me, which is why I use the phrase "be the vessel," because I believe that, to truly be of service, we just allow ourselves to be a vessel for the medicine that's meant to flow through. And that way we keep the thinking mind and the ego mind at bay. We keep that, which is different. It's a lot that you were saying, what you look for in a therapist. It's quite different from the training in a lot of the clinical world, which is to be incredibly thinking oriented and to really analyze and to come in and to meet with a person thinking mind to thinking mind. This is a much different practice. It's a much different way of opening up to the heart space, or to spirit wisdom, or to the guides that come through and point us in the right direction. I don't need to do intakes with people. I don't need to hear a life story. I know where to go, and we go there very quickly. So so this podcast itself is a vessel simply for what is meant to come through. A lot of that is speaking on all topics related to healing mind, body, and spirit, and topics that I feel would help bridge the gap for people, help make it accessible between traditional forms of Western therapy and healing and the spirit world. And really, I just turned on the mic and started speaking and started and channeling and letting it flow. And really, because I'm also at the point where I know that this journey can be easy. It can be easy. And for most of my life, I felt like it had to be so hard, and I had to suffer through it, and I had to do things with so much effort, like I did when I was a kid. So much ADD, I couldn't pay attention. I had to work harder than most kids. And I don't do that anymore. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in going to where the strengths are and allowing the wisdom to come through. And so that's what this podcast is. And I look forward to expanding, into more of the interview platform. And I look forward to having you on the podcast as well. Though that is really, some of the origin story.
That's fantastic. So where can people find you on the interwebs?
So people can find me on my website, which is drdanielatkins.com. They can find me on Instagram, which is Dr. Daniel_Atkins. There's a YouTube channel as well, but you can, if you go to the website or the Instagram, you'll figure out the rest. That's awesome. That's where my blog is, on the website, and the podcasts are there too.
So you're currently working on a book too, right?
Yes, the writing will be a book. It currently takes a lot of the writing takes shape in blog form because also that was the path of least resistance, right? So the idea of, okay, I'm going to sit down and write a book can be a little overwhelming and stressful for the mind. So I was like, no, 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 it's okay. It's just going to be a blog.
Right.
Secretly, it's a little trick, but yes, it will be a book.
Actually, two of my books are blogs that turned into books.
Yeah.
The Spirit Path Book of Days, Volume 1 and Volume 2. So it was basically 2 years worth of blogs
Yeah.
that became books, and they've actually been very well received. And when people ask me what is it, I say it's a collection of essays, and then
Hmm.
everything channeled from spirit. So what I would do is I would do the dowsing, come up with stuff on the dowsing, and then find the pattern, and then just start writing. Both books are even available as audiobooks too, so I was able to do that as well, so which is really, really cool.
Yeah. And at this point, I am committed to a path of least resistance. I have full conviction after having surrendered so much of my life and watching these leaps happen. And it's not to say that there wasn't challenge. There was certainly challenge. And it's not to say you don't take action. I've taken lots of action. But the idea that it has to be stressful, that you have to sort of
That it has to be
e-
hard.
that you effortfully think your way through it is
Right.
the illusion. And so I'm letting go of that in all areas of my life, including the book and everything else that comes forth. So
Right. And actually, I follow that philosophy 100% too. If I'm getting way too much resistance from life on a particular project or something that I'm working on, that's the universe saying you're
yeah.
moving in the wrong direction. You're
Yeah.
pushing too hard. And also, when we're talking about being an influencer versus being someone who's just doing the work and reaching out to people, if you help one person, you've done your job. If only one person listens to your podcast, or if only one person reads your book and is truly experiencing a change in their lives because you touched them in some way, you've done your work. Then there's no other satisfaction that comes out of that. I mean, you don't have to be the next New York Times bestseller in order to get that reach, or change the world. You change the world first of all by doing the work yourself, which you do, and number two is sharing your story and allowing other people to be in on that story as well, which is also part of that healing
I I
process.
I firmly believe that the only work there is to do is to heal the self, and that's whether consider yourself a healer or not. The only medicine we have to give is the medicine we're willing to take, and that's the lesson of going through all this training and collecting all this intellectual knowledge, and but where is the wisdom coming? Where is the knowing coming? The thinking brain can't know. It's always wrestling with doubts and insecurities. It has to come from a deeper place of knowing, and then it just flows out. Then if we're striving to make this sort of public career and to get clients and to get money and to do whatever the ego thinks is really important to do, we're missing the point. And I do believe that the universe has a way of showing us when we're missing the point. And for me to live in that place of integrity, I'm sure I would get sick again if I tried to do it another way. I'm sure it just wouldn't happen. And it takes courage and it
Yeah.
takes faith to let go and trust that this path will
and
manifest, but it
and your
it
and your
is. So
body and your body's also communicating to you.
yeah.
When you get sick while doing something, it's your body telling you, it's your high self telling you, this is not
This
the
ain't for
way.
you. This
No, you're
ain't
not
for
doing
you.
it. You're not doing it right. If you're getting sick doing something, then you're not doing it right. And I
Yeah.
was I was the same way too. When I was in the corporate world, I was getting sick often. That was my body saying, "Hey, yo, you're not doing what you love. Therefore you're going to get sick." And the second that I decided to let all that go and I started doing what I love, I stopped getting sick. It was like
And
it's a miracle. No, it's just you're listening to your body and you're allowing your intuition and also how your body is communicating to you tell you that you're doing okay.
My body has become one of the highest sources of wisdom that I use, because I'm actually able to amplify light frequency, at a very high level, and use it to heal. And I was always sensitive to touch as a kid, so it was the highest source of distress and became the highest source of wisdom and gift.
Awesome. So again, that website is drdanielatkins.com, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. And Daniel, it was wonderful speaking to you, and thank you. And I'm looking forward to being on your show. And to our listeners out there, thank you for listening, and we will see you guys next time. Thank you for listening. For more information about Bill and Nina G, please go to www.vitalbioenergetics.com. See you next time.